I'll have to confess that there's probably been nothing that people have picked up on as clearly as they picked up on the rail fence analogy. And in fact, commonly that shows up in other people's articles and writings. And there have been any number of people write that as if it were theirs and that they invented it, which amuses me, but it doesn't worry me. The fact is that the whole thing came out as a kind of a frustrated reaction to something I was discovering as I went around the world on one of the many trips that I was taking about that period, early in my professional career. I had been invited by a group of Christian missionaries in Latin America to take a hard look at what was then a new phenomenon called the Theological Education by Extension movement. Now that movement was in fact one of the earliest examples of an attempt to take theological education out of the academic structures and put it back in context of churches. And at that point I hadn't given an awful lot of thought to theological education itself. I had been involved in research on professional trainings in a number of fields. I'd done that for the U.S. Office of Education. I had done comparative studies on how you train engineers, how you train doctors, how you train lawyers, how you train undertakers, for heaven's sake. And many of those monographs about that kind of study have still shown up in currency. The field of theological education had interested me, partly because as a Christian I was concerned that the education of Christian leaders for the churches was a really very significant matter, but I guess I was myself locked in so thoroughly to the academic models that I didn't see the fallacies in the educational models that were being used in theological education. Until the trip that I made through Latin America to take a look at the new innovation that was coming about, this theological education by extension thing. Now, some of the people that were leading that movement, including Ralph Winter and others whose names would be familiar, were convinced that the whole thing was a great idea, and like many great ideas, simply needed to be promoted so that it would become even greater. And I looked at it and I thought, well, now wait a minute, let's just look at this. And I first of all reacted negatively to the emphasis on programmed instruction. Ironic, because I had done a lot of work in programmed instruction for the Office of Naval Research, but I suspect one of the half a dozen people in the country who knew how fabulously expensive it was to develop good programmed instruction. And I just couldn't imagine how programmed instruction was ever going to be made available, just in terms of cost, to the tremendous number of places and circumstances, all of which had peculiar differences, where pastors in the churches of the world were being trained. So I wasn't much enthusiastic about that general notion of let's promulgate this on a wholesale basis. And I said, well, the first thing I've got to do is analyze how the pastor really develops his understandings. And it was out of that came the rail fence analogy. Because I discovered that what was going on could be described not by what I was seeing in schools, but what I was seeing in the field where they were trying this theological education by extension. I was seeing three different kinds of functions that were brought together in a coherency that I had rarely seen in an academic environment. And at first I thought, this is kind of amusing because it is so odd. But then as I got over the next several years thinking carefully about it, I thought, my goodness, this is really something very, very significant. And I've lived long enough to see not only that it's significant, all right, but fields of education have picked up on it left and right. And today we have much more alertness to the role of the practical environment in the development of leadership training. But let's look at it. The three aspects of that, and again, looking at things, I always look and I see what are the threes. And I found that the theological education by extension movement had three pieces in it. First of all, it had an academic piece. It had what you'd call a head knowledge piece. It had an information passing piece. That was the business of getting the information and getting it straight and getting it down and getting it memorable. Well, there's nothing new about that. Schools have been doing that for years. But what was new was that the theological education by extension operations that I was looking at were using the on the job, in the field part of the person's life as a deliberate part of the training. So that not only is a person going to a night school and sitting through all the stuff that'll give him the knowledge and information, but he was expected to go back and put that to work and be able to report and to discuss with the participants in the group how that works when you put it to work in the church. That application in the doing, to go back to this other model, the knowing and the being, the doing and then the being, was really a very vital piece, and it could be done as a part of the plan. Heaven knows that schools just don't do this very well. Didn't then, and many still don't do it today. But it is more common today, because the fields that used internships and student teaching and the like were a relatively small number by comparison with the whole business of training professional persons. Even the fields of medicine were tacking the internship on the end, as if somehow you do this after everything else is all done, just to see that the person can do it in the field. But in the theological education, you not only do it at the end, but you do it all the way through the training, so that a person is engaged in the head knowledge, reading and listening to recordings and tapes, and then putting it to work in the churches. But they also had a third piece, and almost no one had examined that third piece. And still to this day, it's the neglected piece. Theological education had three pieces. First of all, the cognitive, the informational, the knowledge base. Second, the doing function, the applied function, the putting it to work in the field. And third, the connective function of the seminar. Now, seminars in so many institutions are nothing but glorified lectures. And the role player in the seminar is typically the instructor, and the seminar is nothing but another class. But seminars should not be anything less than totally distinctive. They should be integrative. And I thought, that's a little like the way a barnyard fence looks. You've got right along the ground a field experience that's close to the context of the reality. And then above that, you've got, in order to hold the big animals in, you've got a fence rail that is up here. And that one is full of information. It may be somehow disjointed from that lower rail, and it'll flop in the air until you put a fence post there. Ah, there's the answer. The fence post becomes the integrator that holds this whole thing together. What's wrong in so much of theological education? I said, it's the lack of fence posts. They've got the planks, they've got the fence rails, but they don't put it together right. So I wrote this little article called The Rail Fence Analogy. And after the first edition of that came out, a very close friend who is very insightful, Sam Rowan, who had been a missionary in Latin America and in the Caribbean for a good many years, said, "Ted, I want to write some more stuff on this thing that you've written." And so together we published yet another version in which Sam added his thoughts, and the whole thing became a matter of rather common occurrence. You'd see this article or reprints of it. And people were really taken by it and said, we really got to do something about that because it makes sense. And so the rail fence itself is top rail, knowledge, information, ideas, data. Bottom rail, close to the ground, real experience. The connectors, the integrators, the spaced seminars. Spaced on an optimal way so that the rails are held together in just the right suspension. And we move from one of those to the next. And the purpose of those seminars is the integrating of the other. The integrating of the materials learned in one rail and in the other rail. That's the rail fence analogy. And it's still valid. And people are still using that to think with about how they're going to build an educational process. But more and more institutions are doing that as whole institutions and making a distinction then between the lecture functions, which are top rail, seminars, which are the spaced interval things where the function is discussion and interaction. The way a leader functions in a seminar should be very different from the way a leader works in a lecture classroom. In fact, I've pointed out that one of the things that you really need is a leader who knows how to let go. And a leader who knows how to let people think for themselves and to talk and to discuss and to try out ideas. Seminars are a great place for people to try out ideas. And yet, when we come in as the dominating professors, we quite often suppress innovative idea and we suppress anything that looks like it may be wrong. And that, to me, destroys a seminar. That's pretty much, in a nutshell, what the model is all about. Now, that's a model for organizing teaching, organizing the institutional education process. You see, when I began working overseas as a consultant, it was in a time when, not long after World War II, the American view of the needs of the world the American view was dominated by a presumption that what the rest of the world needed was what we have. And so what we have to do is to go there and help them do what we do. Well, it didn't take me many years to figure out that's not where it's at. That is not really what's significant. Because in nation after nation, the issue is the differences in culture, the differences in history, and the differences in stages of development and growth call for a fundamentally unique kind of approach to educational transformation. But educational transformation has to have some centralized guidance. And it can have its guidance, as in the rail fence, out of the capacity of people to use information, experience information at work, bottom rail, and integrating through seminar experiences. And that model is probably one of the most ubiquitous. But so long as I was going around saying, do it like we do it, I was making all sorts of stupid mistakes as an international consultant. And it wasn't until I quite literally humbled myself enough to say, I don't think we've got all the answers. I think what we've got to do is to take advantage of the fact that we can be there while these people think with us. We don't think for them. And when we think with them and bring them involved in an interaction of thought, we can then see the generation of that which becomes uniquely Dominican, that which becomes uniquely Haitian, that which becomes uniquely Cuban, that which becomes uniquely Venezuelan, and so forth around the world. And so many of the experiences that I've had follow along in that pattern, and I can trace in my own life the movement from one model to the next model to the next model in terms of my notions of what my purpose is and how best to deal with people in their context. I would say that the seminar itself in the rail fence model is the most commonly flawed and or missing. So what many schools do is simply provide the top rail. They don't even know how to involve people in their real world. And so much of what is done in the developing world is so irrelevant from the reality that people come out of it and have no choice but to go to another nation, which is the brain drain. The reason for the brain drain is that people quite typically have been educated in such a way that they cannot see anything in their own context that fits what they've learned in their classroom experiences. So they have to go somewhere else. And in the Anglophone world, it's largely to England or to the United States. In the Francophone world, it's largely to France. The same thing happens over and over again, and that's why the post-colonial, the old colonial powers have become just as big a menace in their post-colonial forms. And it's very hard to break that. But it is breaking. And one of the reasons it's breaking is because people are saying there are some missing pieces that have got to be put in place.